Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Grey dawn crept through the narrow window of the small room in the servants' wing of Ashworth Manor, touching the simple wooden furniture with pale, reluctant light. The room was barely large enough for the narrow bed, the plain washstand, and the single chair that held Eleanor's few possessions, a life reduced to what could fit in the space afforded to a lady's maid or scullery worker. Lady Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Greymont in name alone, opened her eyes to another morning of exile, another day of bearing the weight of a title that meant nothing within these cold stone walls. She rose without sound, her movements practiced in their silence, years of invisibility, having taught her to disturb no one, to ask for nothing, to exist as a shadow might exist present but unacknowledged. The water in the basin was cold, as it always was, and she washed her face with hands that had long ago stopped trembling at the indignity of her circumstances. 7 years. 7 years she had lived in this room, sleeping on this hard mattress, waking to the same grey light filtering through glass that looked out onto the kitchen gardens rather than the sweeping lawns and rose arbors visible from the grand chambers of the manor's principal floor. She had been 17 when she arrived at Ashworth Manor as a bride, her father's debts transferred to her shoulders like a yoke, her hand given to the Duke of Greymont as payment for sins she did not understand and crimes she had not committed. Nathaniel Ashworth had taken her as one might take possession of property, coldly, efficiently, without ceremony beyond what society demanded. He had looked at her on their wedding day with eyes like winter frost, and she had known even then, young and foolish as she was, that he would never love her, never see her as anything more than the daughter of a man he despised. The servants knew, of course. They had always known. She saw it in the pitying glances of the maids who passed her in the corridors, in the careful courtesy of the footmen who no longer knew whether to treat her as duchess or outcast. Mrs. Davies, the head housekeeper, maintained a scrupulous respect in her presence, but Eleanor had long ago learned to read the sorrow in the older woman's eyes. The manor itself seemed to hold its breath around her, its grand halls and elegant rooms a monument to everything she had been denied. She dressed herself, she had no lady's maid, needed none for the simple grey gowns she wore, and pinned her dark hair into a neat arrangement that required no mirror to accomplish. Her reflection had become a stranger to her over these years, and she avoided it when she could. What was the point of seeing the woman she had become, worn down by loneliness and humiliation into something pale and quiet and nearly invisible? She was 24 now, and felt ancient. The girl who had harbored foolish dreams of earning her husband's affection through patience and devotion had died slowly, day by day, in this small room that smelled of lye soap and resignation. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. 7 years ago, Eleanor had stood in the chapel at Ashworth Manor, wearing a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to her mother, the lace at the sleeves yellowed with age, but still beautiful in the soft light, filtering through stained glass windows that depicted scenes of devotion and sacrifice. How fitting, she would later think, how cruelly appropriate. She had been 17, her dark hair woven with orange blossoms, her hands trembling as they held a bouquet of white roses that seemed to mock the occasion with their purity, their promise of love that would never bloom in the cold soil of this union. Her father had been dead only 3 months, his debts revealed in the chaos following his sudden passing, and Eleanor had understood with a clarity beyond her years that she was being sold to satisfy obligations she had not incurred, to pay for mistakes she had not made. But she had been young enough, hopeful enough, foolish enough to believe that marriage might become something real, that patience and kindness might soften the Duke's stern countenance, that she might earn affection where none had been offered freely. Nathaniel Ashworth had stood beside her at the altar like a statue carved from marble, beautiful and cold and utterly remote, speaking his vows in a voice devoid of warmth, looking at her as one might look at an unfortunate obligation that must be endured with as much dignity as possible. The wedding breakfast had been a torment of false congratulations and pitying glances, society's elite whispering behind fans about the arrangement everyone understood, but no one would name aloud. The bankrupt baron's daughter, given in marriage to settle accounts, a transaction dressed in white silk and orange blossoms. That night, Eleanor had waited in the chambers prepared for her, wearing a nightgown of fine lawn, her hair brushed and loose about her shoulders, her heart beating with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that somehow the man who had barely looked at her during their wedding might see her now, might find something in her worth cherishing. When Nathaniel had entered, still dressed, his expression harder than stone, she had known before he spoke that her hopes were ash. "You are here because your father owed a debt, nothing more," he had said, his voice cutting through her illusions with surgical precision, each word a blade that carved away the foolish dreams she had clutched to her chest. "You will have quarters appropriate to your station, which is to say, the station of a woman whose family nearly destroyed mine through treachery and deceit. Do not mistake this marriage for anything beyond what it is, a settlement of accounts." She had not understood then, had not known what treachery he meant, what crime her father had supposedly committed beyond the sin of dying in debt. But she had seen the hatred in Nathaniel's eyes, cold and implacable, directed not at her precisely but at what she represented, at the blood that ran in her veins and the name she had carried before taking his. He had left her that night without another word, and the next morning servants had moved her belongings to the small room in the servants' wing, where she would spend the next 7 years learning to make herself invisible, and to move through the manor like a ghost haunting the edges of a life that should have been hers, enduring the gradual death of hope and the birth of a quiet, dignified resignation that was both her armor and her cage. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Eleanor's days had fallen into a rhythm of quiet service, her mornings devoted to Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the Duke's elderly aunt who occupied the east wing of the manor and who had, from the beginning, treated Eleanor with a kindness that felt like water in a desert, sustaining something in her that might otherwise have withered entirely. Lady Beatrice was 73, sharp-minded despite her age, her eyes still bright with intelligence and observation, and she had requested Eleanor's company within weeks of the disastrous wedding, perhaps sensing the girl's isolation or perhaps simply wanting companionship that was neither servile nor patronizing. Each morning at 10 o'clock, Eleanor would knock gently on the door of Lady Beatrice's sitting room, a space filled with afternoon light and furnished with comfortable chairs upholstered in faded rose damask, and the old woman would look up from her correspondence or her embroidery with a smile that never failed to ease something tight in Eleanor's chest. They would read together, or Eleanor would read aloud, while Lady Beatrice worked her needle through fabric, and their conversations ranged across literature, philosophy, current events, and history subjects that revealed the breadth of Eleanor's education and the quickness of her mind, qualities that had gone unnoticed and unvalued in the 7 years of her marriage. Lady Beatrice had a way of asking questions that invited confidence without demanding it, gentle inquiries about Eleanor's comfort, her health, her contentment, and though Eleanor never complained directly, never spoke ill of the Duke or detailed the humiliations of her position, the old woman understood everything that went unspoken, reading the truth in silences and careful word choices. "You have a remarkable mind, my dear," Lady Beatrice had said one afternoon, setting aside her embroidery to study Eleanor with eyes that saw too much. "You deserve more than these walls offer you." Eleanor had simply smiled, a small, sad curve of her lips, and changed the subject with practiced grace. Mrs. Davies, the head housekeeper who had served the Ashworth family for 40 years, maintained a respectful formality with Eleanor that acknowledged her impossible position, neither mistress nor servant, neither family nor staff, existing in some liminal space that defied easy categorization. But Eleanor had learned to read the sympathy in the older woman's careful courtesy, the way she ensured that Eleanor's small room was always clean, that hot water appeared in the mornings, that the grey gowns Eleanor wore were pressed and mended without Eleanor having to ask. It was through these small kindnesses, these gestures of respect from Lady Beatrice and Mrs. Davies, that Eleanor had survived the years of exile with her dignity intact, though she sometimes wondered if dignity was enough, if surviving was the same as living. She caught glimpses of the Duke occasionally, usually from a distance crossing the entrance hall as she descended the servants' stairs, riding past the windows as she sat with Lady Beatrice, standing in the doorway of the library as she passed through the corridor beyond. He was 32 now, still achingly handsome with his dark hair and severe features, still cold and remote as winter, still utterly unreachable, and Eleanor had trained herself not to look at him directly, not to wonder about the man behind the frozen exterior, not to waste emotion on someone who had made it abundantly clear that she was beneath his notice and unworthy of his regard. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The library at Ashworth Manor was Eleanor's sanctuary in the sleepless hours that visited her more frequently as the years accumulated their weight upon her shoulders, and on this particular November night, when rain drummed against the windows and wind moaned through the eaves like something lost and seeking shelter, she had abandoned her narrow bed in the servants' wing and made her way through darkened corridors to the vast room that smelled of leather and old paper, and the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco that lingered from the Duke's occasional visits to this space they had both claimed but never shared. She wore only her nightgown, beneath a woolen wrapper, her dark hair loose and braided for sleep, her feet silent in soft slippers as she moved along the shelves, seeking something to quiet her restless thoughts. Not the romantic novels that Lady Beatrice sometimes pressed upon her with hopeful smiles, but philosophy, Marcus Aurelius perhaps, or Boethius, voices from the past who had known suffering and found meaning in it, who had written of acceptance and wisdom in the face of circumstances beyond control. She had just pulled down a worn copy of Meditations, its leather binding soft with age and use, when she heard footsteps in the corridor beyond, measured and masculine, and her heart seized with the knowledge that came too late to permit escape. The Duke was approaching, and she was here in her nightclothes, vulnerable and improper, occupying a space she had no formal permission to use, though no one had ever forbidden her access to these books that were her only comfort. Nathaniel entered, still dressed despite the late hour, his cravat loosened and his dark hair disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, and he stopped just inside the doorway, when he saw her standing there, frozen by the shelves like a doe caught in torchlight, the book clutched to her chest, as though it might serve as armor against his displeasure. For a long moment neither spoke, the silence broken only by rain against glass and the settling of coals in the fireplace that some servant had banked hours earlier. And Eleanor noticed what she had not seen from a distance. He looked exhausted, shadows beneath his eyes and new lines bracketing his mouth, as though some burden had settled upon him and worn channels in his face. "Your Grace," she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper, and she executed a curtsy that felt absurd given her state of undress, but was the only shield propriety offered her. His gaze moved to the book in her hands, and something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, or confusion. "Aurelius," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered, lacking its usual cold precision. "I had not thought." He did not complete the sentence, but Eleanor understood what he had not thought, that she would read philosophy, that she possessed the education or the inclination for such serious texts, that she was anything beyond the unfortunate obligation he had married and dismissed. "I find comfort in his wisdom," she said quietly, lifting her chin with what dignity she could muster while standing before him in her nightclothes, her hair falling over one shoulder, more exposed than she had been in his presence since that terrible wedding night 7 years ago. "He understood that we cannot control what happens to us, only how we bear it." The words hung between them, heavy with meanings she had not intended, but could not retract, and Nathaniel's expression shifted into something she could not read, discomfort, perhaps, or the first stirrings of some emotion he had kept locked away so long he no longer recognized it when it moved within him. "I did not mean to intrude upon your solitude, Your Grace," Eleanor said, setting the book carefully back upon its shelf, though everything in her longed to keep it, and to carry it back to her small room, where she might lose herself in ancient wisdom and forget for a few hours the present moment's humiliation. "I will leave you to your peace." She moved toward the door, every step requiring conscious effort to maintain her composure, to resist the urge to flee like the frightened girl she had once been. And as she passed him, she caught the scent of whiskey and something darker, sadder, the smell of a man at war with himself. She curtsied again at the threshold and slipped into the corridor beyond, her heart racing, her hands trembling, and behind her Nathaniel stood alone in the firelit library, staring at the space where she had been, disturbed by the encounter in ways he could not name and did not wish to examine, the book of Stoic philosophy on the shelf, seeming to reproach him for failures he had never before allowed himself to acknowledge. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Lord Philip Hartwick arrived at Ashworth Manor on a crisp April morning when the gardens were just beginning to wake from winter's sleep, and the air carried the promise of renewal, his arrival announced by the clatter of hooves on gravel and the flurry of servants rushing to greet a guest whose lineage and fortune commanded respect even in a household accustomed to nobility. He was a viscount of 28, handsome in a warm, approachable way that contrasted sharply with the Duke's austere severity, his hair fair where Nathaniel's was dark, his eyes blue and open where the Duke's were grey and shuttered, and when he was introduced to Eleanor in the drawing-room where she sat with Lady Beatrice working on embroidery, he bowed over her hand with a courtesy that struck her like a physical blow in its simple recognition of her status. "Your Grace," he said, his smile genuine and his attention focused entirely upon her face, as though she were someone worth seeing, worth knowing, worth the effort of proper address, and Eleanor felt something long dormant stir within her chest, not attraction precisely, but the almost painful awareness that she had forgotten what it felt like to be treated as a person of value rather than an inconvenient shadow haunting the edges of someone else's life. The other guests who had gathered for the house party, minor nobility and wealthy merchants seeking the Duke's favor, watched this exchange with visible confusion, their eyes moving between Philip's respectful attention and Eleanor's modest grey gown and uncertain expression, trying to reconcile the deference he showed with the peculiar status she occupied in the household, and Eleanor felt their scrutiny like sunlight after years in darkness, simultaneously warming and exposing. Over the following days, Philip sought her company with a persistence that bewildered and frightened her in equal measure, asking her opinions on the books discussed after dinner, inviting her to walk with him in the gardens where early flowers bloomed in defiant splashes of color, engaging her in conversations about poetry and philosophy and current events as though her thoughts mattered, as though she possessed intelligence worth consulting and perspectives worth considering. She found herself responding despite her caution, the words flowing more freely than they had in years, her mind awakening to the pleasure of intellectual exchange, and she caught herself almost smiling during their third walk together when he made an observation about Wordsworth's poetry that perfectly articulated something she had felt but never expressed. From the windows of his study, Nathaniel watched these garden walks with a discomfort that grew more acute each time he witnessed Eleanor's tentative animation in Philip's presence, the way she tilted her head when listening to him speak, the almost smile that softened features Nathaniel had only ever seen arranged in careful neutrality or quiet resignation. He told himself his irritation stemmed from concern about propriety, about the appearance of his wife walking unchaperoned with another man, but the truth writhed beneath these justifications, like something alive and uncomfortable. He was watching Eleanor begin to bloom under another man's attention, seeing her become visible in ways she had never been visible to him, and the sight lodged in his chest like a thorn he could neither extract nor ignore, pressing against something he had believed long dead, and discovering that perhaps he had been wrong about what lay buried in the frozen ground of his own heart. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Weeks passed with the peculiar slowness that accompanies fundamental shifts in the landscape of a life, and Philip's intended brief visit extended into a month and then beyond, his presence at Ashworth Manor becoming as familiar as the morning sun that now seemed to shine more brightly through windows that had long admitted only grey light, and Eleanor found herself waiting for their daily walks in the garden with an anticipation that both frightened and exhilarated her, this small rebellion against the nothingness her existence had become. They spoke of literature with the passion of true devotees, debating the merits of the Romantic poets versus the structured certainty of the Augustans, and Philip listened to her observations about Blake's mysticism and Coleridge's opium-haunted visions, with an attention that made her feel seen in ways she had forgotten were possible, his questions drawing out thoughts she had harbored. In silence for so long, they had grown wild and strange in the darkness of her isolation. When she made a particularly insightful connection between Shelley's atheism and his revolutionary politics, Philip laughed with genuine delight, not mockery, but the shared joy of intellectual discovery, and the sound echoed through the rose garden where they walked, reaching the study windows where Nathaniel sat attempting to review estate ledgers and finding his attention drawn again and again to the scene below, his pen making errors he had to cross out and correct, his jaw tight with an irritation he refused to name. The servants whispered among themselves with cautious hope, Mrs. Davies remarking to the butler that perhaps the Lord Hartwick's kindness would remind certain parties of their Christian duty toward the lady of the house, and even Lady Beatrice observed the developing friendship with eyes that held both satisfaction and sadness, understanding that Philip offered Eleanor escape from a prison whose bars had been forged from cruelty disguised as justice. Eleanor discovered in these weeks that she remembered how to laugh, the rusty mechanism of joy creaking back to life, when Philip told amusing stories of his travels through Italy and his disastrous attempts to learn the local dialects, and she found herself anticipating their afternoon conversations with an eagerness that made her morning hours in her small room seem longer and grayer. By contrast, the weight of her isolation pressing more heavily now that she had tasted what freedom from it might feel like. Nathaniel's disposition grew increasingly volatile as May arrived with its abundance of blooms and birdsong, his instructions to the household staff becoming curt to the point of rudeness, his tolerance for any small imperfection evaporating into harsh reprimands that left maids crying and footmen exchanging worried glances. And he spent longer hours in his study drinking whiskey and staring at documents he could not seem to read, the words blurring before eyes that kept drifting toward the windows and the gardens beyond. It was on a particularly warm afternoon, when honeysuckle perfumed the air with its intoxicating sweetness, that Nathaniel stood at those windows and watched Philip say something that made Eleanor smile, truly smile, her face transforming with such radiance that Nathaniel felt his breath catch in his throat, and the realization crashed over him with the force of ice water that he had never seen her smile before, not once in 7 years, that he had lived with this woman under his roof, and knew nothing of her joy, because he had never permitted her any reason to feel it. The crack that opened in his armor of indifference at that moment was small, barely perceptible even to himself, but it was enough to let in the first cold whisper of something that might have been regret, might have been recognition, might have been the beginning of the terrible understanding that he had destroyed something precious, whose value he had never bothered to assess. And standing there with his hand pressed against the window glass, as though he might reach through it and touch what was already slipping beyond his grasp, Nathaniel Ashworth felt for the first time the possibility that he had been wrong, that his righteousness might have been only cruelty dressed in the robes of justified vengeance, and the thought terrified him in ways he could not yet acknowledge, but could no longer entirely deny. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Lady Beatrice found Nathaniel in his study 3 days after she had watched Eleanor and Philip walking in the garden with their heads bent close in conversation, the afternoon light gilding them both in a way that spoke of futures and possibilities, and she entered without knocking, because she had changed his nappies when he was an infant and held him when his mother died, and therefore claimed the privilege of dispensing truths he would not wish to hear. "She is your wife, Nathaniel," Beatrice said without preamble, her voice carrying the steel that age and aristocratic breeding could forge into an unbreakable blade, and Nathaniel looked up from the papers he had been pretending to read with an expression that began as irritation and shifted quickly to something more guarded when he recognized the set of his aunt's jaw. "What crime did she commit to deserve 7 years of exile in that wretched room, while you parade your righteousness like a banner and punish an innocent woman for sins that were never hers to bear?" The words struck like blows, and Nathaniel rose from his chair with a violence that sent it scraping against the floor, his own anger rising to meet hers because fury was easier than the alternative, easier than examining the foundations upon which he had built 7 years of justified cruelty. "Her father conspired against this house," he said, the words emerging with the force of long-rehearsed conviction. "He sold information to my enemies that nearly destroyed the Ashworth name, that cost us a fortune in legal fees and lost investments, and the respect of half the peerage. And when his schemes collapsed, he offered his daughter as payment, as though she were cattle to be bartered, and I took her because the debt was owed, but I will not pretend she is anything more than what she is, the daughter of a traitor and a schemer." Beatrice regarded him with eyes that had witnessed 8 decades of human folly, found his particular brand both predictable and disappointing, and her next words fell into the space between them, like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread farther than either of them could see in that moment. "Her father is dead, Nathaniel. Her mother is dead. She has no one in this world, no family to shelter her, no fortune to sustain her, nothing but the mercy of a husband who has shown her none. And whatever they did, whatever schemes they perpetrated, she was a child 17 years old, innocent of their machinations, guilty of nothing but bearing their name." She moved closer to his desk, her hand gripping her walking stick with the kind of force that betrayed emotion her aristocratic training usually concealed. "You have punished her for 7 years for crimes she did not commit, taken a frightened girl and broken her spirit systematically and deliberately, and now another man shows her the barest kindness, and she blooms like a flower that has been kept too long in darkness. What does that make you, nephew? What does that make you?" She left before he could formulate a response, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed in the sudden silence, and Nathaniel stood alone in his study, with his hands braced against his desk and his breathing harsh in his ears, the foundations of his righteousness cracking beneath the weight of a question he had never permitted himself to ask. What if he had been wrong? The thought was a small seed planted in poisoned soil, but seeds have a way of growing even in the most inhospitable ground, and as the afternoon light faded and the shadows lengthened across his study floor, Nathaniel Ashworth felt the first tremors of doubt shaking the edifice of certainty he had constructed around his cruelty, and the sensation was more terrifying than any enemy he had ever faced because it came from within, from the possibility that he had become the villain in a story where he had always cast himself as the righteous avenger, and the woman sleeping in the servants' quarters was not the criminal, but the victim, and he was not her judge, but her jailer, and the 7 years of her suffering were not justice, but only cruelty dressed in the costume of moral superiority. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The summer gala at Ashworth Manor had been planned for months, an obligation of their social position that required the gathering of neighboring families and prominent members of the peerage, and Eleanor had expected to fulfill her usual role of near invisibility, perhaps assisting Lady Beatrice with the older guests, while the younger set danced and flirted in the ballroom she had never entered as anything more than a shadow. But Philip's presence had altered the evening's trajectory in ways that rippled through the assembled company, like a stone thrown into still water, creating waves that would not be ignored. He had arrived at her small room in the servants' wing an hour before the festivities began, a shocking breach of propriety that sent Mrs. Davies into flustered confusion and presented her with a gown of deep emerald silk that he claimed his sister had left behind, but which Eleanor suspected he had commissioned specifically for her, the cut and measurements too perfect to be coincidence. And when she descended the stairs in that gown with her hair dressed properly for the first time in years, she heard the collective intake of breath from the assembled servants and felt the weight of their hopeful gazes like a benediction. Philip claimed her hand the moment she entered the drawing room, where guests gathered before dinner, offering his arm with a courtly bow that made explicit what everyone had whispered. But none had dared acknowledge openly that he regarded her as the duchess she was meant to be, not the exile she had been made to endure, and when he led her into the company saying, "May I present the Duchess of Greymont, whose intelligence and grace have made my extended visit the highlight of my season." The assembled guests had no choice but to follow his lead, the women offering curtsies they had never bothered with before, the men bowing with respect that felt both belated and bewildering. Eleanor moved through the evening in a state of cautious wonder, fielding questions about her opinions on current literature and music, discussing the merits of various artistic movements with a gentleman who actually listened to her responses, and she felt herself unfurling like a flower that had been pressed flat in a book and suddenly released to remember its natural shape, her laughter coming more easily as Philip remained at her side, and his attention and regard conferring a legitimacy that 7 years of marriage had never provided. From across the ballroom, Nathaniel watched this transformation with feelings that churned in his chest like a storm he could neither name nor control, seeing Eleanor smile and converse and shine with a radiance he had spent 7 years ensuring she could never display, and the realization that he was losing something he had never valued until the moment it slipped from his grasp, filled him with a possessive fury that finally drove him across the room to where Eleanor stood speaking with Philip and an elderly countess about the Lake poets. "Eleanor, I require a word with you," he said, his voice carrying the ducal authority that had always commanded immediate obedience, and the use of her given name, the first time he had spoken it in perhaps 3 years, caused her to turn toward him with surprise that shifted quickly to wariness, the light in her eyes dimming as though a candle had been shuttered, and when she excused herself from the group and followed him to the library, he closed the door behind them and faced her across a space that felt simultaneously too large and suffocatingly small, and the words that emerged were not the reasoned discourse he had intended, but rather an accusation born of jealousy he could not acknowledge. "You forget yourself and your position, madam, parading about in borrowed finery and accepting the attentions of a man who is not your husband." And Eleanor, who had endured 7 years of far worse than this, drew herself up with a dignity that would have shamed him had he been capable of shame in that moment, and replied with a voice like frost over steel, "I forget nothing, your grace, least of all that you have made it abundantly clear. I am your wife in name only, a punishment you inflict rather than a partner you value. And if Lord Hartwick treats me with the respect you have denied me, I shall accept it gratefully, because it is the first kindness I have known in 7 years, and you have forfeited any right to object to how I receive it. Asterisk, 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 asterisk." Philip found Eleanor in the rose garden 2 days after the confrontation in the library, the morning mist still clinging to the hedgerows like shrouds, and he carried with him the gravity of a man who had made a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. His handsome face set with a determination that spoke of both courage and compassion, and when Eleanor saw his expression, she knew before he spoke what he had come to say, felt it in the quality of the air between them, the shift from friendship's easy companionship to something weighted with consequence and irreversible choice. "Eleanor," he began, taking her hand with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with unshed tears, "I cannot stand by and watch you suffer any longer in a marriage that is no marriage at all, watch you wither in the shadows when you should be standing in the sun, and I have consulted with my solicitors about the possibility of an annulment. The marriage was never consummated. You have witnesses to the arrangement's peculiar nature, and with the right arguments before the ecclesiastical courts, you could be free within a year, perhaps less." He paused, his thumb brushing across her knuckles with an intimacy that was both comforting and terrifying in its implications. "You deserve happiness, Eleanor. You deserve to be loved, cherished, treated with the respect and tenderness that should be any wife's portion, and if you will permit me, I would be honored to offer you that life, to marry you properly once you are free, to give you the home and family and partnership that have been denied you for 7 interminable years." The proposal hung between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, escape from the prison that Ashworth Manor had become, the chance to build a life with a man who saw her, valued her, would never relegate her to a servant's quarters or treat her existence as punishment for sins she had not committed. And Eleanor felt the temptation of it pull at her like a tide, strong and insistent and promising salvation from suffering that had become so familiar she hardly remembered what life without it might feel like. That night she lay in her small room with the narrow bed and bare walls, the space that had been her exile for 7 years, and let her mind travel backward through time to the girl she had been at 17, arriving at this manor with foolish hopes that kindness and patience might earn her husband's affection, that she might transform a marriage of obligation into something resembling partnership, that the coldness in his eyes might thaw if she proved herself worthy. And she remembered the systematic destruction of those hopes, the gradual understanding that she was not a wife but a prisoner, not a duchess but a ghost, haunting corridors where she had no right to exist, and the woman she had become in those years was stronger than that hopeful girl. Yes, tempered by suffering into something resilient and unbreakable, but also so very tired, worn down by the daily weight of invisibility and humiliation, and the peculiar cruelty of living beside a man who treated her as though she did not exist, except as a reminder of debts and grievances that had never been hers to bear. As dawn broke over the manor, painting her small window with pale gold light, Eleanor made her decision with the clarity that comes from having endured too much for too long, and she rose from her bed with a sense of purpose she had not felt in years, her hands steady as she dressed, her reflection in the small mirror showing a woman who had finally chosen herself over suffering, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would ask Nathaniel for an annulment, that she would accept Philip's offer of freedom and the possibility of happiness, because she had paid enough for her father's sins, had served enough time in a prison of her husband's making, and if there was a chance, however small, however uncertain, to live a life where she was valued rather than punished, seen rather than erased, loved rather than merely tolerated as an inconvenient obligation, then she would seize that chance with both hands and never look back at the years she had lost to a man who had never wanted her, except as a vessel for his righteousness and rage. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Eleanor requested an audience with the Duke through the formal channels that governed their estranged arrangement, sending word through his secretary that she required a private meeting on a matter of utmost importance, and the formality of the request itself seemed to convey the gravity of what was to come, so that when she entered his study at the appointed hour with her spine straight and her hands folded with deliberate composure, Nathaniel stood behind his massive mahogany desk with an expression that suggested he already knew this conversation would alter the fragile equilibrium they had maintained for 7 years, though perhaps he did not yet understand how completely. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart against her ribs, "I have come to request that you petition for an annulment of our marriage, as the union has never been consummated and exists in name only, a legal fiction that has served whatever purpose you required, but which has become untenable for me to continue bearing, and I believe the ecclesiastical courts will find ample grounds to dissolve what was never truly a marriage in anything but the most technical sense." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, and she watched the shock register on Nathaniel's face, the color draining from his features as though she had struck him physically, rather than merely spoken a truth he had never expected to hear, and for a long moment he simply stared at her as though she had transformed into someone he did not recognize, which perhaps she had, and the doormat wife he had trained through 7 years of neglect, suddenly standing before him with agency and determination he had never imagined she possessed. "Absolutely not," he said finally, his voice carrying the autocratic certainty of a man accustomed to immediate obedience, his hands gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles whitened. "The scandal alone would be ruinous. The gossip would destroy both our reputations, and the family honor cannot withstand such a public acknowledgement of our arrangement's peculiarity. I forbid it, Eleanor, and that is the end of this discussion." But Eleanor had not endured 7 years of exile to be dismissed so easily, had not spent sleepless nights weighing her choices to surrender at the first refusal, and she lifted her chin with a dignity that would have made Lady Beatrice proud, and said with a quietness that somehow carried more force than shouting, "I have endured 7 years of scandal as your wife in name, Your Grace, living in servants' quarters, while guests whispered and society speculated about what crime I must have committed to deserve such treatment, and I would rather face whatever gossip comes from ending this farce than continue as your ghost, invisible and unacknowledged, a punishment you inflict rather than a partner you value, and Lord Hartwick has offered me the possibility of a true marriage, a life where I might be seen and valued and treated with the basic respect that should be any wife's portion, and I will not remain in this prison of your making when freedom stands before me." She watched something shift in his expression as she spoke, saw the moment when her words penetrated his assumptions, and he understood, truly understood that she was not asking permission, but informing him of her intention, that the woman he had relegated to the margins of his household for 7 years was prepared to walk away from the title and position and security that most women would cling to desperately, would choose uncertainty and social censure over the peculiar cruelty of their arrangement, and in that moment Nathaniel felt the first terrible grip of panic, as he realized he was about to lose something he had never valued, until the instant it slipped from his grasp. Eleanor curtsied with the perfect form she had been taught as a girl, turned with unhurried grace, and walked from his study with her head high, leaving him standing alone among his books and ledgers, and the suddenly suffocating silence of a man who had just glimpsed the consequences of 7 years of casual cruelty, and the sound of the door closing behind her echoed through the room like the final note of a requiem for a marriage that had never truly lived. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Nathaniel stood alone in his chambers as the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet, and the silence that had seemed companionable for 7 years now pressed against him with the weight of accusation, forcing him to confront truths he had carefully avoided examining too closely, and he poured himself brandy with hands that trembled slightly, drank it without tasting, poured again, seeking numbness that refused to come because Eleanor's words echoed through his mind with relentless clarity. "Times I would rather face it as Philip's true wife than continue as your ghost times," and the realization that she would actually leave, would choose uncertainty and social censure over remaining his wife, struck him with the force of a physical blow to a place he had not known was vulnerable. He sank into the leather chair by the fire and let his mind travel backward through the years to the source of his hatred, to the carefully nurtured grievance that had justified 7 years of cruelty. Lord Pemberton, Eleanor's father, had conspired with the Duke's political enemies to destroy the Ashworth name, had leaked sensitive documents that nearly cost Nathaniel his position at court, his reputation, everything his family had built over generations. And when Pemberton's gambling debts had grown so massive that bankruptcy loomed, Nathaniel had seen divine justice in the opportunity to demand payment in the form of his enemy's daughter, to make the man watch as his child was reduced to servant status in payment for treachery, a living reminder of consequences that could not be escaped. But Lady Beatrice's words haunted him now with their simple, devastating truth. Asterisk. She was a child innocent of their schemes. Asterisk. Eleanor had been 17 when her father signed the marriage contract, a girl who had no knowledge of political machinations or adult vengeances, who had arrived at Ashworth Manor with hope in her eyes despite the circumstances, and he had looked at that hope and seen only her father's face, had projected onto her innocent shoulders all the rage and betrayal he felt toward a man who was beyond his reach, and he had spent 7 years punishing her for sins she had never committed, destroying a young woman's life to satisfy his need for revenge against a ghost. The guilt that rose in him then was like bile, burning and bitter, and Nathaniel found himself standing without conscious decision, pacing his chambers like a caged animal, driven by a restlessness that was entirely new, a need to understand what he had done, who he had punished so relentlessly, and he rang for his valet with sudden determination, asked questions he had never thought to ask before. What was Eleanor's character among the servants? How did she spend her days? What did those who knew her think of the woman he had reduced to a ghost in his own household? The answers came slowly, carefully, the servants uncertain whether honesty would be punished, but gradually a picture emerged of a woman of extraordinary grace and dignity who treated everyone with kindness regardless of their station, who read philosophy and poetry in multiple languages, who had become a beloved companion to Lady Beatrice, who never complained about her treatment or spoke ill of the Duke despite having every reason to do so, who carried her suffering with a quiet strength that had earned the respect and affection of an entire household, and Nathaniel listened to these revelations with growing horror as he realized he had spent 7 years refusing to see a woman of remarkable character and intelligence, had deliberately blinded himself to her worth because acknowledging it would have interfered with his righteous anger, his need to make someone pay for the wounds his pride had suffered, and the man he saw reflected in these truths was not the honorable Duke he had imagined himself to be, but rather a petty tyrant who had committed a profound injustice against someone utterly innocent, and the weight of that realization threatened to crush him beneath guilt too heavy to bear. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The storm arrived 3 days after Eleanor's request for annulment, sweeping across the estate with the fury of nature indifferent to human concerns, and Eleanor had been walking in the far gardens when the first drops fell, seeking solace in the physical exertion that might quiet the tumult in her mind. But the rain came with sudden violence, and she was soaked through before she reached the manor, her thin dress clinging to her frame as she stumbled through the servants' entrance, shivering and pale, and by evening the fever had set in with the swift brutality that sometimes follows such exposure, her body surrendering to an illness that seemed almost like punishment for daring to reach for freedom. And Mrs. Davies had her moved immediately to a guest room because the small servants' quarters had no fireplace adequate for a sick room, and sent word to the Duke, as protocol demanded, though no one expected him to care about the wife he had exiled for 7 years. But Nathaniel came, drawn by something he could not name, arriving at the guest room to find Eleanor delirious with fever, her skin burning beneath his palm, when he touched her forehead with a gentleness that surprised the attending maid, and he dismissed the servants with quiet authority, pulling a chair to her bedside and settling into a vigil that defied every rule of propriety and distance he had established between them, watching her toss restlessly against the pillows as the fever painted her cheeks with unnatural color and drew from her lips whispered fragments of dreams and memories that pierced him like arrows aimed at his conscience. "So cold," she murmured, though the fire blazed and blankets covered her. Always so cold in that room, so small, so alone. And Nathaniel felt each word as an indictment, understanding for the first time the daily reality of the punishment he had inflicted, the loneliness of 7 years in exile. And when her hand reached out blindly in her delirium, he caught it without thinking, held it between both of his, as though he could anchor her to consciousness through touch alone, and she clutched at him with surprising strength, her fingers curling around his as she whispered, "Please," with such naked desperation that his heart cracked open beneath the weight of all the pain he had caused this innocent woman who had never deserved his cruelty, who had borne 7 years of suffering with a dignity that shamed his vindictiveness, and he found himself whispering apologies she could not hear, promises he had no right to make, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in a gesture of tenderness he had denied her throughout their marriage. Philip arrived the next morning, his face drawn with genuine concern when he learned of Eleanor's illness, and he came directly to the guest room, only to find Nathaniel still there, unshaven and exhausted from his night-long vigil, sitting beside Eleanor's bed with her hand still clasped in his, and something in that tableau, the Duke's protective posture, the way he looked at his wife, as though she was something precious he had only just discovered, made Philip pause in the doorway. And when Nathaniel's head snapped up at the sound of footsteps, the expression on his face was one of such fierce protectiveness that Philip recognized it immediately as the jealous guardianship of a man who has realized too late what he stands to lose, and the Viscount felt his own hopes shifting like sand beneath his feet, as he understood that whatever he had hoped to offer Eleanor, the Duke was finally awakening to claim. "How is she?" Philip asked quietly, and Nathaniel's response came rough with sleeplessness and emotion. "The fever broke an hour ago. The doctor says she will recover." But the way he said it, the relief that flooded his features, spoke of something far deeper than mere concern for a spouse's health, and Philip saw in that moment the beginning of a transformation he had hoped for but had not truly believed possible. Saw the Duke of Greymont discovering love for the wife he had spent 7 years ignoring, and though it complicated his own desires, Philip could not help but feel a cautious hope for Eleanor's sake that perhaps redemption was possible even for those who seemed beyond its reach. Asterisk, 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 Eleanor. Woke to weakness and the strange disorientation that follows fever, her body feeling insubstantial as cobwebs, her mind struggling to piece together fragmented memories of heat and cold, and a hand holding hers through darkness she could not name. And when she asked the maid attending her how long she had been ill, the answer came with hesitant glances toward the door. 3 days, my lady, and the Duke himself sat with you through the worst of it, never leaving your side until the fever broke. And Eleanor absorbed this information with profound confusion, because in 7 years Nathaniel had never shown the slightest concern for her welfare, had never sought her company, had never touched her except for that brief moment when their hands met during the marriage ceremony, and the idea that he would keep vigil at her sickbed seemed so contrary to everything she knew of him that she wondered if it was merely fever dream, hallucination born of delirium and desperate longing, but the evidence accumulated in ways she could not dismiss. Meals arrived from the Duke's own kitchen rather than the servant's fare she was accustomed to, delicacies chosen specifically for an invalid's sensitive stomach, and Mrs. Davies reported with barely concealed hope that His Grace inquired after her health every few hours, had ordered the best physicians summoned, had instructed that nothing be spared for her comfort and recovery, and Eleanor lay propped against pillows in the guest room that was still not the Duchess's chambers, but was infinitely better than her small servants' quarters, trying to make sense of this transformation that seemed too sudden to be trusted, too dramatic to be anything but temporary aberration, born of guilt or obligation, or some emotion she could not identify. She saw him only from a distance, in those first days of recovery, catching glimpses of him in the hallway outside her room, or watching from the window as he paced the gardens below, with the restless energy of a man wrestling with thoughts that gave him no peace, and once their eyes met across the length of the corridor, and he stopped mid-stride, seemed about to approach, but then turned away as though lacking courage for direct encounter, and Eleanor felt her heart twist with something that might have been disappointment, though she told herself firmly that she had no right to such feelings, no reason to expect anything from a man who had made his indifference abundantly clear for 7 years. Philip visited daily, bringing books and conversation and the easy warmth she had come to treasure, And it was during one such visit that he made the observation that changed everything. "He watches you when you're not looking, Eleanor," Philip said quietly, his blue eyes gentle with understanding. "I have seen the way the Duke positions himself where he might catch sight of you, the way his attention follows you, even when he pretends to be occupied elsewhere, and I think perhaps there is more to his heart than you have been permitted to see, more feeling than he has allowed himself to acknowledge until the prospect of losing you made it impossible to ignore any longer." Eleanor sat very still, her teacup arrested halfway to her lips, and felt the foundations of her certainty shifting beneath her. Because Philip's words gave shape to observations she had been afraid to trust, patterns she had dismissed as wishful thinking or misinterpretation, and she found herself caught between the impulse toward freedom that had seemed so clear just days ago, escape from her prison through annulment, and a new life with a man who valued her, and this strange new possibility that perhaps Nathaniel was changing, that perhaps the transformation she had glimpsed during her illness was not temporary but rather the beginning of something she had spent 7 years believing impossible, and the conflict between these two paths forward left her suspended in uncertainty, unable to choose between the safety of known kindness and the terrifying hope that redemption might be possible even for those who seemed beyond its reach. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Nathaniel found Eleanor in the garden 5 days after her recovery began, walking slowly among the late roses that clung to life despite autumn's approach, and he had rehearsed what he would say 100 times in the sleepless nights since her illness, words that seemed inadequate to bridge 7 years of cruelty, but were all he had to offer, and when she turned at the sound of his footsteps on the gravel path, he saw the wariness in her eyes, the protective distance she maintained, even as propriety required her to acknowledge him with a curtsy. He waved away with uncharacteristic impatience. "Eleanor," he began, and her name felt strange on his tongue after years of avoiding its use. "I must speak with you, if you will grant me a few moments of your time." And she nodded slowly, her hands clasped before her in that posture of dignified composure he had come to recognize as her armor against the world. And he struggled to find the words that had seemed so clear in his mind, but now scattered like leaves before wind as he faced the reality of her presence, the evidence of all he had done to diminish this woman who stood before him with quiet strength, despite everything. "I have been cruel," he said finally, the admission costing him more than he had anticipated, unconscionably, unforgivably cruel. "And I blamed you for sins that were never yours to bear, punished you for your father's transgressions when you were nothing but an innocent girl caught in circumstances beyond your control. And I can offer no excuse that would justify what I have done, no explanation that would make 7 years of exile and humiliation somehow acceptable." Eleanor's face remained carefully neutral, but he saw her fingers tighten their grip on each other, saw the slight tremor that ran through her frame, and he pressed forward, because retreat now would be cowardice. "Your father conspired with my enemies, helped them spread lies that nearly destroyed my family's reputation, my mother's health. But Aunt Beatrice was right. You were a child then, innocent of such schemes. And even if you had known, even if you had been complicit, 7 years of punishment for another's crimes is monstrous, and I have been a monster to you, Eleanor, in ways that shame me to acknowledge." The silence stretched between them, filled with the rustle of dying roses and the distant call of birds preparing for migration. And when Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, carrying the weight of accumulated pain. "Why now?" she asked, and the simplicity of the question cut deeper than accusation. "Why, after 7 years of treating me as less than the lowest servant, do you suddenly discover conscience? Is it because Lord Hartwick showed interest? Because I dared to request freedom? Because your pride cannot bear the thought of losing a possession you never valued?" And Nathaniel felt the justice of her skepticism like a blade between his ribs, understanding that words alone could not heal wounds so deep, that his transformation, however genuine it felt to him, must seem like manipulation or temporary aberration to a woman who had endured years of his calculated indifference, and he met her eyes directly, allowing her to see the genuine anguish he felt, the weight of guilt that had become unbearable. "I cannot undo those years," he said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I cannot give you back the life you should have had, the respect and affection that were your due as my wife. But I would spend the rest of my life trying to atone if you would permit me, Eleanor, if you could find it within yourself to grant me the chance to become the husband I should have been from the beginning." And even as he spoke, he knew the presumption of such a request, knew he had no right to ask for anything from her after what he had done. But hope, desperate and painful, had taken root in his chest during those hours at her sickbed, and he could not surrender it without at least trying to bridge the chasm his cruelty had created. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her grey eyes searching his face for truth or deception, and when she spoke, her honesty was absolute, unflinching in its assessment of the damage between them. "I don't know if I can forgive what you've done, Nathaniel," she said, using his given name for perhaps the first time in their marriage. "I don't know if I can trust you, or if these gestures of kindness are genuine transformation or merely temporary guilt that will fade once you feel you've done enough to absolve yourself. And I am tired, so very tired, of hoping for things that never come, of believing in possibilities that prove to be illusions." And her voice broke slightly on the last words, revealing the depth of her exhaustion, and Nathaniel understood that he was asking her to risk her heart again, after he had spent 7 years teaching her that such risk led only to pain, asking her to believe in change when all her experience told her that people remained what they were, and the magnitude of what he had destroyed and what he hoped to rebuild settled over him like physical weight as he nodded slowly, accepting her doubt as the rightful consequence of his actions, and knew that earning her trust would require more than words or gestures, would demand consistent proof over time that his transformation was real and lasting, and he was prepared to spend whatever years remained to him providing that proof if she would only grant him the chance. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The courtship began with such smallness that Eleanor almost missed its significance, waking one morning to find a volume of poetry on the table beside her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, Wordsworth, which she had mentioned in passing during one of their stilted conversations, and though no card accompanied the gift, she knew its source from the deliberate care with which it had been selected, the expensive binding that spoke of attention paid to details she had not realized he noticed, and she ran her fingers over the leather cover with something between hope and fear, understanding that accepting this offering meant acknowledging the possibility of change, meant opening a door she had kept firmly closed for 7 years. The invitations came next, delivered formally through Mrs. Davies, though Nathaniel himself was often nearby when they arrived, his presence in corridors and doorways suggesting he lacked courage for direct approach, but could not stay away. Would Lady Eleanor do the Duke the honour of joining him for breakfast, for a walk in the gardens, for tea in the library where they might discuss the philosophy texts she favoured? And each invitation was phrased with such careful respect, such consciousness of her right to refuse, that Eleanor found her defences gradually eroding, despite her determination to maintain protective distance. She accepted cautiously at first, armouring herself for disappointment or discovering that his transformation was temporary performance rather than genuine change. But the man who met her at the breakfast table bore little resemblance to the cold stranger who had ignored her existence for 7 years. Nathaniel asked her opinions on estate matters, listened with apparent genuine interest when she spoke of books she had read or thoughts she had developed during long solitary hours, and though awkwardness lingered between them like morning fog, she glimpsed beneath it someone who seemed earnestly trying to know the woman he had refused to see, and the discovery unsettled her in ways she could not entirely name. The servants whispered hopefully as weeks passed and the invitations continued, as Eleanor was seen more frequently in the Duke's company, as Nathaniel's attention to his wife became obvious to everyone who observed them, and Mrs. Davies reported with barely concealed satisfaction that His Grace had ordered flowers placed in Eleanor's room each morning, had instructed the kitchen to prepare dishes he had somehow learned were her favourites, had asked detailed questions about her daily routine, as though constructing a map of her existence he should have known 7 years ago, and Eleanor absorbed these small evidences of care with cautious wonder, afraid to trust them fully, but unable to deny their accumulating weight. Philip noticed the shift during one of his final visits, before departing for his own estates, his blue eyes gentle with understanding as he observed Eleanor and Nathaniel together in the drawing-room, the way the Duke positioned himself near his wife without crowding her, The way Eleanor's posture had relaxed slightly from its habitual defensive tension, and when Philip requested a private word before his departure, Eleanor knew what he would say before he spoke. "I see the connection forming between you," Philip said quietly, as they walked the garden path one last time. "And though my offer remains if you should ever need it, I think perhaps your happiness lies not in escape but in the possibility of redemption, in allowing your husband the chance to become what he should have been from the beginning." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at his kindness, his willingness to release her from the safety he represented, and when she thanked him for everything he had offered, friendship and respect, and the mirror that showed her she deserved better than she had accepted, he smiled and said simply, "Choose happiness, Eleanor, wherever you find it, and do not let fear of past pain prevent you from embracing future joy." And his blessing settled over her like benediction as she watched him ride away. Understanding that she stood now at a crossroads between the revenge of departure and the risk of forgiveness, between the woman she had been forced to become and the woman she might yet be if she found courage to believe that people could change, and that 7 years of cruelty might be followed by something better if she would only grant the possibility, and as Nathaniel appeared in the garden seeking her company with that expression of hopeful uncertainty she had come to recognize, Eleanor made the first tentative choice toward a future she had stopped allowing herself to imagine, and accepted his outstretched hand. The months that followed Philip's departure unfolded like the gradual warming of earth after long winter, imperceptible at first in individual moments, but undeniable in their accumulated effect, and Eleanor found herself drawn into a pattern of days that bore no resemblance to the 7 years of exile that had preceded them. Mornings that began with breakfast shared in the sunny morning room, where Nathaniel asked her thoughts on estate matters with genuine interest. Afternoons spent walking the grounds while discussing philosophy and literature, and evenings in the library, where comfortable silence had replaced awkward distance, and she could feel his eyes on her as she read, watching her with an intensity that made her aware of him in ways she had never permitted herself before. She learned him slowly. This man, who was technically her husband, but felt like a stranger she was meeting for the first time, discovered that beneath the cold exterior he had maintained for 7 years lived someone far more complicated than she had imagined, wounded by his family's near destruction at her father's hands. Yes, but also capable of unexpected humor, possessed of a keen intelligence that matched her own, surprisingly well-read in subjects she had thought herself alone in enjoying. And she watched him struggle with the weight of his guilt, saw how he caught himself sometimes looking at her with such regret that it was almost painful to witness, and gradually she began to understand that his transformation was not performance, but genuine reckoning with the man he had been and the man he wished to become. Nathaniel, for his part, fell in love with his wife during those months of careful courtship, though the realization came not as sudden revelation, but as gradual certainty that built with each conversation, each shared laugh, each moment when Eleanor's carefully maintained composure cracked enough to let him glimpse the woman beneath, brilliant and resilient, and possessed of a grace that humbled him when he considered all she had endured at his hands, and he found himself cataloguing details about her that he should have known years ago. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating on a difficult text, how her eyes lit with genuine passion when discussing ideas that engaged her mind, the rare smile that transformed her entire face and made him ache with awareness of how seldom he had given her cause for such expression, and desire grew alongside affection, physical awareness that made him conscious of every accidental brush of hands, every moment when proximity allowed him to catch the scent of lavender she favored, every time her lips moved over words, and he found himself wondering what they would feel like against his own. The tension between them built like summer storm gathering on the horizon, electric and inevitable, manifesting in lingering glances and conversations that stretched late into evening, in the way Nathaniel found excuses to be near her, and Eleanor no longer immediately withdrew from his presence, in moments when they stood close together examining a book or map, and neither moved away despite propriety suggesting they should, and servants whispered that the Duke and Duchess were finally becoming what they should have been from the beginning, that love was growing where only coldness had existed, but still Eleanor returned each night to her small room in the servants' quarters, and though neither spoke of it directly, that bare chamber with its narrow bed stood as symbol of everything that remained unresolved between them, the years that could not be undone, The question of whether forgiveness could truly bridge such vast distance, and Eleanor lay awake in that room that had been her prison and refuge, touching her lips where she had caught herself imagining his kiss, pressing her hand to her heart that beat faster now in his presence, wondering if she dared believe that the happiness growing between them might prove more durable than the pain that had preceded it. While in his chambers, Nathaniel paced and planned, and promised himself patience even as longing consumed him, knowing that Eleanor's trust must be earned through consistent proof over time, that rushing her would risk destroying the fragile connection they had built, but hoping nonetheless that the day would come when the barrier of that small room would finally fall, and she would take her rightful place, not just as Duchess in name but as his wife in truth, his partner, his beloved, the woman he had failed so completely, but whom he would spend every remaining day of his life cherishing if she would only grant him that precious chance. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The crisis arrived with the autumn rains, carried on malicious tongues from London, where Lord Edmund Carstairs, one of her father's former associates, and a man who had profited from the scheme that nearly destroyed the Ashworth name, began spreading rumours about the peculiar arrangement at Greymont Manor, whispers that reached society, drawing rooms like poison seeping through cracks, suggesting that the Duke kept his wife in servants' quarters because she was mad or diseased or morally deficient, insinuations that perhaps her father's sins ran deeper than mere financial betrayal, that perhaps Eleanor herself had been complicit in schemes that warranted such unusual punishment, and though the gossip was transparently motivated by Carstairs' desire to deflect attention from his own role in past scandals, it gained traction among those who found the Duke's treatment of his wife curious and were eager for explanations that satisfied their appetite for drama. The rumours reached Nathaniel during a meeting with his steward, delivered by an apologetic Mr. Pemberton, who felt his grace should know what was being said, and Nathaniel felt fury rise in him like floodwater, not at the insult to his own name, but at the cruelty of attacks aimed at Eleanor, who had endured enough humiliation without society adding to her burdens, and he understood with sudden clarity that his months of patient courtship meant nothing if he did not publicly claim her. If he allowed the world to continue believing she deserved the exile he had imposed, and he made his decision with the same decisive certainty that had once characterized his cruelty, but now drove him toward redemption. He found Eleanor in the morning room with Lady Beatrice, her face pale as she read a letter that had arrived from a former friend, one of the few who had maintained contact during her years of isolation, warning her of the gossip spreading through London. And when Nathaniel entered, she looked up with such resignation in her eyes, as though she had expected this final blow, as though scandal was merely the natural conclusion to 7 years of degradation, that his heart constricted with rage at everyone who had hurt her, himself most of all. "We are going to London," he announced without preamble, his voice carrying the authority that had cowed lesser men, but which he softened when he addressed Eleanor directly. "I will not allow these lies to stand, and I will not ask you to endure further insult in silence." And though Eleanor began to protest that leaving would only fuel speculation, that perhaps it was better to remain quiet until the gossip faded, Nathaniel shook his head with fierce determination and said words he should have spoken 7 years earlier. "You are the Duchess of Greymont." And it is past time society understood what that means. The journey to London was accomplished swiftly, and Nathaniel arranged a ball at Ashworth House, with such speed that the Tun barely had time to register surprise before invitations arrived, commanding attendance, and on the night of the event, Eleanor stood beside her husband in the receiving line for the first time in their marriage, dressed in sapphire silk that Nathaniel had commissioned for her, wearing the Ashworth diamonds that were her right as Duchess, and when Lord Carstairs arrived with his wife unable to refuse the Duke's summons without admitting guilt, Nathaniel's greeting was coldly courteous until the moment came for his prepared speech. Before the assembled guests, with Eleanor's hand clasped firmly in his own, Nathaniel spoke with a voice that carried to every corner of the ballroom. "Lady Eleanor is the Duchess of Greymont, a woman of impeccable character who has been grievously wronged by me most of all, and I say this publicly so there can be no misunderstanding. Any insult to her is an insult to me. Any slight against her name will be answered as though it were directed at my own honor, And if Lord Carstairs or anyone else suggests that my wife deserves anything less than the utmost respect, they will find themselves answering to me in whatever manner I deem appropriate." And the threat in his words was unmistakable, the promise of social destruction, or worse, hanging in the air like sword waiting to fall, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as society witnessed what she had never imagined. Nathaniel claiming her publicly, defending her fiercely, making clear that she was not merely tolerated but treasured, and when he turned to her afterward with such tender concern, asking privately if his declaration had embarrassed her or if she would have preferred he handle the matter differently, she understood fully that the man before her bore almost no resemblance to the one who had condemned her to exile 7 years ago, and the last defensive walls around her heart began their long-delayed crumble into dust. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. They returned to Greymont Manor 3 days after the ball, and the journey passed in conversation that ranged from light-hearted observations about London society to deeper discussions of what the future might hold. And Eleanor felt something shifting within her chest, a loosening of bindings she had wrapped around her heart for protection during 7 years of loneliness. And when they arrived home, the servants greeted them with genuine warmth that acknowledged what everyone had witnessed. The Duke's public claiming of his wife had changed everything, had transformed Eleanor's position from tolerated presence to honored Duchess, and she moved through the remainder of that day in a state of cautious joy, sharing dinner with Nathaniel, where they laughed over Lady Pemberton's shocked expression, when the Duke had cut Lord Carstairs so thoroughly, discussing plans for improving the estate's tenant cottages, talking like partners rather than strangers, and when evening came, Eleanor felt reluctant to end the day, wishing she could preserve this fragile happiness that felt so new and precious, but habit and years of routine drew her eventually toward the servants' wing, toward the small bare room that had been her refuge and prison, and as she climbed the narrow back stairs, she felt the weight of symbolism pressing on her shoulders. This room represented everything Nathaniel had done to her, every humiliation and abandonment, the physical manifestation of 7 years spent as ghost rather than wife. And when she opened the door and saw the narrow bed, the simple washstand, the few meager possessions she had been permitted to keep, something inside her broke. She sank onto the thin mattress and wept as she had not allowed herself to weep in all those years, cried for the girl of 17 who had arrived with foolish hopes of earning her husband's affection, for the countless nights spent alone in this cheerless space while Nathaniel slept in ducal chambers she had never been invited to enter. For all the moments of casual cruelty and studied indifference, for the woman she might have become if given the chance to flourish instead of merely survive, and her tears came in great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame because the day's triumph had somehow made the past's pain more acute rather than less, had highlighted the contrast between what was and what might have been, and she did not hear the door open or notice Nathaniel's presence until he spoke her name with such anguish that she looked up through tear-blurred vision to find him standing in the doorway, his face stricken as he took in the bare room that he had consigned her to, the narrow bed where she had spent 7 years of nights, the stark reality of what he had done rendered undeniable by his physical presence in this space. Nathaniel had come seeking Eleanor to continue their earlier conversation about the London house renovations, had climbed the servants' stairs for the first time in his life, and seeing her weeping in this room, this terrible small room that was all he had permitted her for 7 years, destroyed something fundamental in him, shattered the last defenses he had maintained against the full weight of his cruelty, and he crossed the small space in 2 strides and dropped to his knees before her, his own tears falling freely as he grasped her hands and said brokenly, "Forgive me, Eleanor. God, forgive me for what I have done to you." And his grief was so raw, so genuine in its devastation, that Eleanor found herself reaching to touch his face, even through her own tears, and they knelt together in that bare room, weeping for all the lost years, for the marriage that should have been, for the suffering that could never be undone but might finally begin to heal. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. They remained on the floor of that small room for what might have been minutes or hours, time losing meaning in the weight of shared grief and tentative forgiveness, until finally Nathaniel rose and helped Eleanor to her feet, and he looked around the bare chamber with such revulsion, not at the space itself but at what it represented, at his own cruelty, made manifest in plaster and wood, that Eleanor saw him make a decision, saw determination settle over his features like armor being donned for battle, and he said quietly, but with absolute certainty, "You will never spend another night in this room, Eleanor. I swear it on everything I hold sacred." And though she began to protest out of habit, out of 7 years of learned deference, he shook his head and took her hands in his with a gentleness that still surprised her and said, "No more exile, no more punishment for crimes you never committed, no more allowing my pride and anger to dictate your suffering. You are my wife, and tomorrow at noon, when the entire household can bear witness, I will carry you from this place to the chambers that should have been yours from the beginning." And Eleanor felt her breath catch at the symbolism of such a public act, understanding that Nathaniel was offering not just new quarters but complete restoration of her position, a declaration before servants and God that their marriage would begin anew. The next morning passed in a strange suspension of normal routine as word spread through the manor that something significant was about to occur, and the servants gathered in halls and doorways with barely concealed curiosity, and Eleanor dressed in one of the new gowns Nathaniel had commissioned for her deep rose silk that made her skin glow and her eyes shine. And when the clock in the great hall chimed noon, she stood in the doorway of the small room that had been her prison, her heart beating so rapidly she thought it might escape her chest. And then Nathaniel was there, dressed formally as though for a ceremony, and without a word he swept her into his arms with a strength that reminded her he was no aging invalid, but a man in his prime, and he carried her down the narrow servants' stairs while the household staff lined the route, and Mrs. Davies wept openly, and young Mary, the chambermaid, pressed her hands to her heart. And when they reached the main floors where the family portraits gazed down from panelled walls, Nathaniel's voice rang out clearly, "My wife belongs here, at my side, in the place of honor she should have occupied 7 years ago, and let no one in this house or beyond it ever question her position again." And Eleanor's tears flowed freely as he carried her through corridors she had walked as a ghost, past rooms she had been forbidden to enter as more than a passing shadow, until they reached the Duchess's chambers that adjoined his own. These rooms she had seen only once on her wedding day, before being dismissed to servants' quarters, and when Nathaniel set her gently on her feet and she looked around, she gasped at what she saw. The chambers had been transformed into a space that spoke of careful attention to her preferences, shelves filled with books on philosophy and history that he had noticed her reading, a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light because she had once mentioned she thought best in early hours, paintings of the countryside rather than formal portraits, because he had observed her pause before landscape scenes in the gallery, fresh flowers in shades of cream and lavender that he had learned were her favorites, and every detail proclaimed that he had been paying attention during their months of tentative courtship, had been learning who she was and what brought her joy. And when she turned to him with wonder in her eyes, Nathaniel said softly, "I cannot give you back the 7 years I stole from you, Eleanor, but I can offer you every day that remains to us, if you will have me not as the cruel stranger who made you his prisoner, but as the man who loves you more than he thought himself capable of loving anyone, and who will spend his life proving himself worthy of the grace you have shown in not destroying me for what I have done." And Eleanor crossed the beautiful room to stand before her husband, this complicated man who had wounded her so deeply, but who was fighting so hard to heal what he had broken. And she took his face in her hands and kissed him for the first time in their 7-year marriage, a kiss that tasted of salt from tears and possibility, and the fragile hope that broken things might be made whole again through patience and genuine transformation. And when they finally drew apart, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "Thank you for giving me a second chance I do not deserve." And Eleanor replied with hard-won wisdom, "Perhaps we both deserve the chance to begin again." And in the Duchess's chambers that she had finally been permitted to claim, they began the true intimacy of marriage, not just physical union, though that would come in time, but the deeper intimacy of two souls, choosing to trust each other despite pain and betrayal, choosing to build something new from the ruins of what had been. And outside the windows the autumn sun hung at its zenith, marking the moment when Eleanor's exile ended and her life as Nathaniel's true wife finally began. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. 3 years passed like the turning of seasons, and Greymont Manor transformed from a place of shadows and silence into a home filled with laughter and light, and on a golden afternoon in late summer, Eleanor stood at the window of the Duchess's chambers, watching her children play in the gardens below little Catherine, with her father's dark hair chasing her younger brother Thomas across the lawn, while Nathaniel followed behind with exaggerated slowness to give them the thrill of escape. And Eleanor's hand rested on the slight swell of her belly where a third child grew, and she marveled at the fullness of a life she had once thought impossible, at happiness earned through patience and the courage to forgive what had seemed unforgivable. The small room in the servants' quarters remained exactly as it had been on that transformative day 3 years prior, kept by mutual unspoken agreement as a reminder of what cruelty looked like, what suffering felt like, what must never be permitted to happen again. And sometimes Eleanor walked past it and felt the ghost of the woman she had been brushing against her consciousness. And instead of pain, she felt gratitude for the strength that suffering had forged in her, for the wisdom to recognize genuine transformation when she witnessed it. And Nathaniel had proven his change not through grand gestures alone, but through 3 years of consistent devotion, through patience when she woke from nightmares of exile, through understanding when old wounds occasionally reopened, through his absolute commitment to honoring her as his true wife and partner in all things. She heard his footsteps in the corridor and turned as he entered their chambers, slightly disheveled from playing with the children, his face alight with the joy that had replaced the cold hardness she remembered from early years, and he crossed to her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they gazed out at their children together, and he said softly, as he often did, "Thank you for giving me a second chance, Eleanor, and for not condemning me to the hell I deserved for what I did to you." And she turned in his arms and touched his face with the tenderness of hard-won love, and replied as she always did, "Thank you for becoming the man worthy of that chance, for proving that people can change if they truly wish to, for giving me the life I dreamed of as that foolish girl of 17. And they kissed with the depth of intimacy that came from surviving fire together and emerging transformed. And later, when the children were asleep and the manor settled into peaceful quiet, they lay together in the great bed that had finally become theirs in every sense. And Nathaniel held Eleanor close and marveled aloud at the grace she had shown in forgiving him, and she smiled in the darkness and thought of the journey that had brought them here through cruelty and exile, through jealousy and illness, through tentative courtship and hard-won trust, through symbolic gestures like being carried at noon from servants' quarters to Duchess's chambers, through 3 years of patient rebuilding. And she understood that some transformations required time and suffering to achieve, that redemption was not granted, but earned through consistent, changed behavior, that forgiveness was not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. Dear listener, perhaps you have known the pain of being dismissed by someone who should have cherished you, or perhaps you have been the one who inflicted such wounds and now seek redemption. Know that transformation is possible for both the wounded and the wounder, that patience can heal what seemed permanently broken, that second chances given and received in genuine faith can create beauty from ashes, and that the courage to forgive the seemingly unforgivable or to seek forgiveness for the inexcusable requires strength beyond measure, but offers rewards beyond imagining. So if you find yourself in Eleanor's position, remember that you deserve to be valued and honored, and if you find yourself in Nathaniel's position, know that genuine change demonstrated through years of consistent action can earn what mere words never could, and may you find the wisdom to know when transformation is real and when it is merely performance, the strength to protect yourself from those who would wound you repeatedly, and the grace to forgive those who prove through time and deed that they have truly changed. And may your nights be peaceful and your rest be sweet. Thank you for listening to this story on Sleeping Tales. If it touched your heart, please like and subscribe for more narratives of transformation, redemption, and the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest wounds.